I'm going to quote from an essay in an article by Stephen Henighan entitled A Report on the Afterlife of Culture. And the article is entitled How They Don't See Us. Now, it begins with an anecdote in which Henighan is in New York at a seminar organized by celebrity academic Edward Said. And while he's there, he listens to a presentation, a speech by a sociologist, an Australian sociologist named Michael Taussig. Quote, "That night Taussig spoke not about Colombia, but about Australia. He assessed the extent to which Australians with non-British Isles surnames, such as his, had succeeded in entering the Australian elite. After the talk, a woman asked Taussig whether he thought that some of his general points about Australian culture might also be applicable to Canadian culture. Quote, "The thing about Canada," Taussig said, "is the way it doesn't have a culture. It has no history or art or," end of quote. Feeling compelled to intervene, I asked Taussig, quote, "But when you say that Canada has no culture, aren't you, as an immigrant to the United States, simply internalizing U.S. stereotypes about Canada rather than studying Canadian reality?" End of quote. Taussig shifted in his chair and did not reply. Irate New Yorkers turned belligerent gazes on the impertinent nobody who had asked the question. Edward Said, effortlessly in control in a navy blue suit, suggested that we all go downstairs for drinks. And then Henighan continues, quote, "These two incidents," he tells another anecdote about meeting an American who hates it when Canadians insist that they're different from Americans. And Henighan continues, quote, "These two incidents have returned to my mind in recent months when I have been traveling in England and traveling in Europe. A certain cheerleading Canadian journalism maintains that Canada's culture is respected throughout the world. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The cultural particularities that many Canadians cherish are invisible abroad. Our fiction is little known abroad and barely recognizable as Canadian. Our national debates about multiculturalism, bilingualism, and coexistence with the omnipotent United States, which others might find illuminating, receive no international airing," etc. Now, what I'd like to focus on is Henighan's remarks about culture, because I think they're particularly timely right now. Just through my Facebook feed, there was an article by Jesse Brown of Canadaland in which he observed that Rogers, the media conglomerate, had received over $8 million in government subsidy and was still cutting jobs, was still cutting magazines. And he asked, was Rogers receiving grant money for magazines that weren't getting published? Now, that's a particularly extreme example of, if it's true, of corporations taking advantage of the rules. Public broadcasters in Canada have a bad reputation and a bad track record of actually producing Canadian culture. The Canadian writer John McFetridge once remarked to me in another Facebook feed that the attitude among private broadcasters in Canada is never a minute more than CRTC regulations mandate in terms of the production of Canadian programs. As any Canadian knows watching TV, as any Canadian who grew up watching TV knows, there is an inordinate amount of American culture that we get. And apart from the CBC, really, there isn't a whole lot that the private broadcasters do. They're money machines which generate income from buying U.S. shows and sometimes British shows and showing them here in order to take a profit. The Globe columnist on TV, John Doyle, has also been very good on this topic. Now, it may seem that the Canadian publishing is somewhat separate from this whole sort of cynical exercise in basically a process of self-colonization, but I'm not sure that it really is. And I think it's time that we had a bit of a debate about the direction that Canadian fiction publishing is going in. First of all, there's an interrelationship and there's an increasing tendency, as far as I can tell, to integrate the publishing industry with the movie production industry in Canada, which also has a very embarrassing track record in terms of winning audiences, although that's more a question, I think, of distribution than anything else. However, the publishing industry tends to pride itself on doing better than the TV and movie industries. And the first question that I'd like to ask is whether we really should compartmentalize our cultural production that way. Should we consider publishing and TV and movie making all as separate things, or should we combine them somewhat? And I think maybe from a certain point of view, at least from an analytical point of view, that might make sense to consider narrative fiction as a whole and not necessarily assume that one medium is completely discrete from another medium. And the second thing that I think is worth discussing is whether Canadian publishing is really doing that great a job at producing material about Canada. I have lived overseas for a very long time, and I'm deeply sympathetic to writers who want to write about other countries. I understand that. The world is an interesting place. But it does seem to me that there is a tendency right now for Canadian writers and publishers to sort of downplay the Canadianness of some of their content, and to certainly not be very ambitious. This is a particular pet peeve of mine. Not be particularly ambitious in terms of producing big social novels about Canada. I think that is a real shortcoming, and I think that is something that we need to talk about.